Welcome to the Contractor Counsel Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Contractor Counsel Podcast with Joshua Irvine. Joshua is a business and tax attorney based in Utah who works with construction and trade companies as outside general counsel, helping them get paid, stay compliant, and build stronger businesses. I'm Sean O'Connor, and in this episode, we're getting into what actually happens when business partners aren't on the same page and why most of these problems trace back to what was never put in writing at the start. Hi, Joshua.
Hey, how are you today?
I'm doing all right. The old yo bro agreement, we'll deal with it later situations, right?
Yeah.
Where do partnerships in construction companies usually start to break down when, there isn't a clear operating agreement?
The first thing is just understand from a framework that the rules that we typically put into an operating agreement oftentimes are already there in principle. I mean, there are laws in every state, Utah's no exception, that when two people start a company together, and however formally or informally, there are base laws that apply as to how you work together, whose rights to leave the company or sell or whatever, right? So that framework exists. An operating agreement is if we want to have a different standard. Either we want to have different rights, we want to have things more black and white, because the base law might be very general and generic and not very helpful for your industry or for your business idea with your new partner, right? So that's kind of the first step, is just to realize if you do nothing, something's already there. You just may not realize what your rights are. And so out the door is just knowing that this isn't about should I have it or should I not. It's rather, do I like what the standard rules are, which you probably don't even know what they are, or do I want to have something a little bit more customized for my unique business, investor or partner, or however you want to structure it.
What is it that partners usually assume is understood early on that ends up causing problems later? What have you seen?
Sure, yeah. Literally, I've had this over the last week, multiple back and forths with a partnership that's kind of on the verge of breaking up because they were not very clear in the beginning. And so what I find is a lot of times people go into business with their partners, with their friends, with their trusted advisor, whoever, because they simply trust them. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the areas where there becomes problems in the future, it really is because there was a breakdown as to the expectations of all the parties involved. How much work are you going to do? Will you be an employee or just an owner? Are you going to put more money into the company? Who has legal rights to leave the company and sell their part of the company? What happens if I become an alcoholic? What happens if I lose my license? I know it's kind of a little bit weird and maybe even cynical to think about those things, but an operating agreement is kind of like a prenup for your business.
I was just kind of in my mind, I went there, I was like, communication. What do you mean you don't want to have kids? What? Didn't you talk about this already?
Yeah. Yep.
Interesting. What do you think needs to be spelled out so there's no confusion about, who has decision-making authority in the business?
The first is to figure out what's your percent ownership, because two partners might not be 50-50, right? Legally, you might have two partners, but I hate 50-50 because that presents the possibility that we can do nothing because we won't agree. I'm not saying it has to be 90-10, but I think from the beginning, you have to have some kind of expectation of what role each of you is going to play in the business. And that's a great time to really hash out your strengths and your weaknesses. If you're really good at bringing in clients, then maybe you're over the sales and production side of things. If you're really good at finances and back office stuff, maybe that's your area. And you want to spell that out so that there's not frustration later when money starts coming in and feelings start getting hurt.
I was building off of this idea of like, oh, you hate the 50-50 thing. And I was like, hey, you've got expertise back of house. I got expertise front of house. Can you put in an agreement that when it comes to those particular areas, I get the final say? Or if it's an operational issue, you get the final say. That was the essence of that question.
Yeah, and the short answer is yes, you can. Obviously, that's not going to be the default law in any state. And so if you want to have that kind of clarity, you're 100% going to need an operating agreement. And you could easily do that where I get final say on these 5 categories, you get final say on these 5 categories. And then on other categories, it requires us to be unanimous or super majority if you have multiple, owners. Things like selling the company or taking out debt or something like that. But in fact, I'm thinking of a partnership dispute where they were 50-50. They didn't spell out some of these things. A lot of it was kind of loose handshake type understandings that ended up costing each of those parties over $100,000 in a lawsuit to fight about it because it all came to a head.
Well, I'm wondering, the other thing in my mind here is, of course, money and profits, and I'm wondering, where do ownership and say profit splits start to create tension between partners?
Probably 2 areas. The first area is when an owner also works as an employee of the company, because then you start to get 2 different hats and feel like you're entitled to more. You might be. If you are truly working as an employee, if the employee gets paid $80,000 a year, is that a W-2 wage? And then the profits are still split according to your ownership. So that's a dynamic you have to figure out if you are going to work in the business. And most contractors work in their business. So
I was
you
going to
have
say
to
in the
figure that
contracting
piece
world,
out.
that's
How much
pretty
is my
common, right?
salary as an employee? And then
Yeah.
therefore, what's my profit? If it's just you, it doesn't matter. If it's you and your spouse, it probably doesn't matter that much either. But if it's you and somebody who's not your relative, not like your spouse, then you're probably going to have to figure out how that works. And then the second way that the money issue comes up is when you start investing money in the company. Sometimes there's a difference between the profit interest in the company and the ownership interest in the company. And that gets into a whole game of taxes and other strategies, but just simply being clear, when you're putting money into a company, are you going to be paid back differently than your partner who may have put in less or none, into that business?
How do you go, somebody wants to sell or get out of the business, when one person wants out of the business, one partner wants out of the business, what usually goes wrong if there's no clear plan in place?
Well, by default, most laws require that all the owners of the company give unanimous consent for the sale of part of the company, which makes sense. Yeah.
That's the
Yeah,
baseline
that
law.
makes sense. I wouldn't want someone to sell part of my business if I didn't give permission. Right? I get
Right.
that. And I
Right.
wouldn't want to be in business with somebody that I didn't know or trust. So that makes sense. But
Of
that's
course,
not
yeah.
always very realistic, because what happens when I stop getting along with my business partner? So one of the big areas in an operating agreement that you really flesh out is exactly this issue of, how do I exit the business? How do I sell my interests? Or
Yeah.
what's going to trigger that? There's a voluntary and an involuntary, right? If I voluntarily want to sell,
All right.
maybe that means I have to give what's called a right of first refusal to my partner or the other partners to buy out my interest first. And if they don't, then I get to go
That makes
to the
sense, yeah.
market and sell it to somebody else. And involuntary,
But then you end up with you could end up with a partner that you didn't necessarily,
you don't know, you don't like.
like if I'm the person selling,
Yeah, it's a problem. The other side that actually a lot of people forget, especially in construction world, accidents happen, injuries happen. I've seen clients who've passed away at a younger age than they were supposed to. And then you're in a dynamic where the ownership of the company is considered a property right. And now you're dealing with the estate of that former partner. And now all of a sudden a spouse or a child who's trying to come in and take over their interest in the company. And so you want to have some trigger that allows you to buy out those interests so you can navigate the business correctly, not with all of these other people you didn't know.
What about controls? Like what controls whether a disagreement between partners stays, say, manageable, or turns into a full-blown dispute, with litigation and all that?
I would say the willingness of the parties to talk it out, because I mean, I use the silly, yeah, I mean, I
Communication.
use it as a silly example that an operating agreement is like a prenup. And the idea is that when you start a business, you don't really want to end the business any more than when you get married. You're not intending to get divorced, hopefully, but it does happen. And you're contemplating these things hypothetically. So if you can talk it out, if you can communicate, if you can mediate, if you have a third party that can help you guys handle some of those issues, then great. Maybe you can continue your business together. If you reach a point where you're like, this is irreconcilable, then you turn to your documents and you say, okay, how are we going to split up our assets, our company? And what does that look like?
Yeah, and having thought about it in advance, and I mean, you may not have thought of everything, right? But at least you've got some kind of a framework in place that will probably inform other decisions that need to be made now that the business, has grown. Assuming you're X number of years on from that original agreement. Is that something? Speaking of the prenup analogy, or estates and trusts, and I'm thinking about the updating of documents. Is the ownership agreement something that, or the operating agreement, something that you recommend being reviewed periodically?
Well, for sure, if you're going to change ownership, it should be reviewed and updated. If the actual underlying laws of your state change, then it should be updated, because there might be conflicts with your documents and the new rules. And then if you've seen other situations in other partnerships, you might want to add something because, I didn't think about that at that time, but now let's make sure we add it.
Or there may be, I guess, some sort of a dispute comes up that you and your partners don't quite know how to navigate.
Like from a high level, I'd say every 3 or 4 years is a good time to just dust it off and make sure we're on the same page.
What about, when you've been doing this a long time, I'm wondering if you could walk us through a situation where, a missing or weak operating agreement created major problems for a business, one of your clients or someone else.
Yeah, and you don't actually have to look very far in history. There are a lot of tools, and I won't name any tools so I don't get in trouble. There are a lot of tools online that allow you to draft documents that may or may not cover all your bases. But a lot of times, especially business owners that are startup phase, they use those free or cheap tools because it's an inexpensive way to accomplish what you think you're supposed to do as a business owner. But you don't know what questions to ask, and those tools might not know what answers to give you. So I've seen it very recently, in fact, where people are using some of those, current tools to try to accomplish these structures, and they immediately fall into problems where there's inconsistencies or there's a lot that wasn't really included in that document because,
generic.
You didn't know what to ask it. You didn't know what to deliver. And so you're like, I think that looks good. It looks official.
Well, what's your recommendation? If a contractor already has a partnership but no real agreement in place, what's the first, 1 or 2 things they need to lock down?
Well, if they have some kind of understanding in any kind of written form, it would be to make sure that that's still their understanding. It doesn't matter if it's an email, a text exchange, whatever it is. If they really have nothing except a handshake and let's get going together, I mean, I think you kind of start from scratch, but not so much because you're worried about it ending, but because, hey, as we've been in our business for 10 or 20 years together, now we're starting to get older. We want to get out. We got health issues. So you can start to contemplate, like, what does the transition look like? And that can be the reason you're putting this together.
Yeah, right. My son's coming into the business, or son-in-law, or not, or daughter, or whatever.
Or not, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. Lots to consider. Thanks. Joshua, we're kind of out of time for this episode, but I'm sure we'll talk again in the future. Thanks for sharing your expertise and your point of view. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the time.
Thanks for listening to the Contractor Counsel Podcast with Joshua Irvine. If you're a contractor or business owner and you want to make sure your contracts, your systems, and financial processes are set up to protect your work and your bottom line, you can learn more at Joshua's website, irvine-legal.com. And don't forget, leave a review, a thumbs up, maybe subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an episode. I'm Sean O'Connor. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.